Hello and welcome to A Tale of Thought and Technics. Today we are going to be talking about the descent of man. In last episodes we started off with speaking about mathematical models of history as itself unfolds, and also cosmic evolution, cosmic history that has predated what we would call human history. And then we continued on speaking about the biosphere. And now we're speaking about the descent of man. The origins of man and the origins of human consciousness. Both of these topics, man and consciousness, are intertwined, as well as the topic of technics. As we're speaking about thought and techniques in this lecture, we will be focusing on that precisely, and this will kick off the beginning of looking at human history specifically. So essentially, we are trying to bridge the gap between looking at the history of life on this planet and human history, as this tends to be done in a very harshly delineated way. So to say, we speak about the evolution of species, or we speak about the arrival of species on this planet, disappearance of those species, their development, and then there's a hard cut and we move on to the history of humanity based on entirely different methods of study. And this is the issue in general when we look at studying disciplines that require a multitude of methods, because we do not have a kind of universally accepted way of integrating separate and different methods of scientific study. So for example, we have this infamous nature-nurture problem when speaking about whether certain human traits such as intelligence or other personality traits are inherited, meaning innately biological or part of our innate natural configuration, or whether they are influenced by our environment, by our social environment, or even our natural environment. And there, the separation, first of all, of environment and nature and innate features is very difficult, especially because there's no clear delineation in many cases, at least not methodologically. And there is also feedback effects. There's also the involvement of feedback effects where certain environmental influences could trigger a kind of innate biological aspect in such a way that it is reinforced, and you cannot really speak of a kind of linear percentual influence of one or the other. And part of that reason for that complexity is that you do not have a unifying method. If you study environmental influences, you may do that through questionnaires, through psychometric methods. And if you look at genetic influences, you're doing that through the study of gene attribution studies, or twin studies, or twin adoption studies, and all of which have very different approaches, have very different methods of studying the field, and thus finding a common way to compare the influences, to put them in a context, to have a proper way of modeling them, is not yet found. And this problem is increased hundredfold when looking at history, because you have to necessarily make specific exceptions or specific selections about what you want to study, about what you're focusing on, as in this case we're focusing on thought and techniques. So there you have very different approaches meeting each other. For example, you get evolutionary biology and the study of fossils, and then the extrapolation of certain evolutionary developments based on fossil discoveries, then transitioning into looking at early hominids, which then focuses on fossils as well, but different kind of fossils. There the focus shifts specifically, at tools, at human tools, at spears, at primitive flintstone that has been uh, processed into a certain shape. And there we already arrive at a first kind of bias that is very clear and is something that Lewis Mumford speaks of in his work on the myth of the machine. As we focus on these technological attributes, our perception is biased towards it, just as our perception is biased towards those animals, those prehistoric animals that may have been extinct now, but that have been preserved in some kind of fossil, and we've excluded all those naturally that cannot be found in fossils. And thus, we've also excluded in our focus studying early human societies, we've excluded any non-technological aspect to their thought and techniques. For example, high art, for example, poetry, music, stories, narratives, potentially even other kinds of technologies that are not preserved as well as treated stones. Also, for example, housing or clothing that wouldn't be preserved, especially in areas that don't have easy natural preservation methods. For example, hominid structures, hominid societal remnants that are found in caves or swamps that represent a kind of natural preservant. And so we are kind of left in the dark in this transitional phase because we have this gap of methods focusing on biological fossils, and then the other method focusing on technological artifacts. And then we have another even larger gap following on from this when we start first focusing on historical written records. Once we get into like the early Egyptian or Babylonian periods, and then moving towards classical antiquity, the focus entirely shifts heavily onto written accounts of history, specifically preserved by the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, very much focused on Greek and Roman literature of classical antiquity, yet another strong bias. So as I've mentioned already, we have this problem of a bias towards structures that haven't been discovered or preserved in technological artifacts. And here is the crux of the issue, and that is what it means to be human and what human historical unfolding would represent can be skewed and understood very differently if we exclude potentially a vast amount of human societies and human structures. So, for example, in their work, The Dawn of Everything, by David Graeber and David Wengrow, they actually speak of alternative ways in which human societies would have been aligned before we had the rise of human civilization, meaning that there was cultures and societies in small groups and tribal units that were set up differently, that didn't exhibit the kind of inequalities in power and wealth that we find in civilizations since. In this case, they're trying to counterbalance a kind of bias we have towards the notions of conquest, of expansion, of territorial rule, something we spoke about in the introductory episode of this lecture series, namely the kind of geopolitical cycles of expanding empires. There seems to be a kind of bias involved in this where you could say in some ways patriarchal, in some ways warrior-like, in some ways dominant and aggression-based power dynamic and power structure is something that has biased our view of history, where we focus explicitly on these kind of structures, but leave out other forms that would have been just as human, so to say, but would have either perished through the conquest of other cultures that did exhibit the dominant spirit, or they are just basically neglected, disappeared, or even exist in some remnants today. And that could be due to very different and diverse influences. For example, if you have an environment, a natural environment that does not involve many predators and has an abundance of vegetarian nutrition, you may have more egalitarian, more matriarchal societal structures. Whereas if you have an area that has scarce resources, that requires high coordination and high compliance of authority, you may exhibit more warrior like, more patriarchal societies. And they don't necessarily need to exclude each other. You could actually say that the dominance of one over the other and the subsequent adaptation to a kind of symbiosis. What you have often in nature is a kind of parasitism developing into symbiosis, because a pure exploitative parasitism will abolish itself once it's extinguished its host. So, for example, if a warrior group only pillages and destroys, they may not have any bounty to gain anymore. So eventually they arrange themselves in a kind of protector role against other warrior groups for the local, more agricultural, egalitarian tribal group. And that's where you'd have the first initial versions of a feudal society or an early civilizational society, where you have a warrior caste and a farmer caste, which then is supplemented by a kind of priestly class that holds it together. It's a kind of dialectic, a synthesis that has arisen out of that interaction. And this ties into something that Pareto already spoke about when speaking about types of elites, where you have the lions, which justify their power entirely based on dominance, and you have the so-called foxes, which justify their power based on professionalism, expertise, knowledge. And that is where you get the first priesthoods, and priesthood being, you could say, a kind of an organized priesthood being the first indicator of a human civilization as we know it in our recorded history. So going back to that transition point of looking at early human history and civilizational history, we get many different forms of studying this. One of it is the impressive work by Fraser. The Golden Bough is something that anyone with the funds and the patience to get it and read it should have a look into. If not, there's, I think, an abridged version. The Golden Bough being a enormous compendium of anthropological studies on various cultures, historically, contemporary, and their traditions and their behaviors. And then, secondly, an analysis of that work, Totem and Taboo, by Sigmund Freud, where he actually looks at the intersection of the, you could say, primitive, pre-societal, civilizational human and into the more modern, formally organized human. And that is looking at the early taboos and the totems as early representations where there's an alignment between human culture and human nature. For example, the taboo of incest, of marrying someone from within your family, that taboo is something that can very well be something arisen through evolutionary strategies. Evolutionary strategies would end up prohibiting this kind of behavior, as it would be detrimental evolutionarily speaking. For example, because a lot of incest could lead to offspring eventually becoming impotent and not being able to reproduce in turn, leading to only those that avoid incest surviving, and thus it's becoming an evolutionary strategy of behavior. And at the same time, that evolutionary strategy is solidified and maintained through an early memetics, an early archetype that is represented by the totem, namely the totem being the symbol that unites the particular group one belongs to, and thus encoding in a kind of rule that one may only mate, one may only have children with someone from a different totem. So you have this transition from instinct towards a social rule, towards a social consensus, and thus the rise of another level of environment on top of the natural environment, that is the social environment. And it's been clear that the social environment is a much more intense driver of evolution than the natural environment, and that is especially through the rise of sexual evolution, of sexual reproduction, sexual dimorphism, where you have the necessity of having a mating partner, and thus the necessity of engaging in behavior that secures you a mating partner, making it essentially important to engage in the right way, to engage the correct strategy within your social environment in order to survive and have offspring and have your offspring survive. So you get this acceleration, especially because through the sexual reproduction, you get a much faster intermixing of new genetics and new genomes. And so you get an essential an acceleration, intensification of the impact of the environment through the rise of the social environment on top of the natural environment. And you could say the social environment, which was already there in species like a lot of mammals that are very loyal to their kin, that has even more accelerated through the feedback of the rise of human language and culture, which is why we have to never forget that the focus on human tools is a bias that may distract us from focusing on what could be the more important social environment, and that is the environment that is verbal, the environment that is carried through tradition, rules, verbal feedback through poems, stories, songs, legends, myths. And so there is something about this that is captured in the art you find in ancient caves, in prehistoric cave art, Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic cave art. Something that Clayton Eshelman speaks of in his amazing work Juniper Fuse. It's pretty hard to get a hold of this, but I recommend anyone that could get a hold of this to get a copy. Perhaps your local library has it and you can photocopy it if that's allowed. So Eshelman writes in his introduction, quote, "The Upper Paleolithic resurfacing can be thought of as a retrieval of depth, of a bottomlessness that is not simply absence, but one complexed with hidden presence and invisible connections. While cavestone might well be thought of as the tabula rasa par excellence, caves themselves are hardly tabula rasas. Each has its own character. For some, the cave's sensory isolational atmosphere is experienced as spirit-filled, even as hallucinogenic. For example, grotesque and hybrid cave images suggest a fusion between early consciousness and subterranean entities. It is as if the soul of an all-devouring monster earth could be contacted in cavern dark as a living and fathomless reservoir of psychic force. We see our present world of vanishing species not only against what we know of the immense and diverse biomass of Pleistocene Europe, but also against the end Pleistocene extinctions that eerily forecast our own. While climatic change, unaffected by humans, appears to have played a major role in early extinctions, there is credible evidence that from the late Upper Paleolithic on, especially in the New World, extinctions have been increasingly human-induced." So I am haunted by the rock shelter's name, where our ancient and direct ancestors' skeletons were first discovered. Aber du Cro-Magnon, or Shelter of the Big Hole People. It seems that over the centuries, our big wholeness has increased in proportion to our domination of the earth. Today it is as if species are disappearing into and through an us that lacks a communal will to arrest their vanishing. So, what he's speaking of is the kind of surfacing, the rise of consciousness out of this unconscious dream world, peaking above the surface level of the water, where the majority of the iceberg is still unconscious, still beneath the surface. That peak above the surface is expressed in early cave art. It is expressed in that art form, and potentially in songs and stories and other art forms, something that needed to predate the development of tools and the development of more modern structures. So the idea of representing something that has gained its own life in your unconscious mind, this kind of autonomous complex, this archetypal entity, is externalized and represented, and thus is captured into something consistent. So, for example, if you are engaging with wild animals such as buffaloes, and then at some point start dreaming of buffaloes, and they appear in your mind, especially in the darkness of a cave, you project them onto the cave, paint them, and suddenly they become something graspable, something that can be brought up anytime by going to that same place, by accessing that area of the cave, and thus they can be accessed in a way that a thought can be accessed in conscious reflection that we know of, but we take for granted. And so this is something that is conditioned by our social environment, but also by our cognitive environment. So this is where we get into autopoietic systems. Autopoietic systems being systems that are not created by something external, but are systems that reproduce themselves, that are engaged in recreating their own conditions of preserving themselves. And on top of our biological system, then the two systems of the cognitive and the social systems are systems that people like Luhmann or Maturana focus on. And the intersection of these systems, of the social and the cognitive, is that which uniquely makes us human, that which uniquely determines our rise from initial unconsciousness. This intersection is obviously very complex, very hard to disentangle, and in many ways something that's inexplicable. But it represents something that is essential to what we spoke about in the biosphere or the cosmic evolution. It is this essential drive of the cosmos to self-reproduce its own elements, but also preserve it, but also develop into something that increases complexity and increases in multiple forms of sophistication. So I would like to show you a clip by Maturana where he speaks about the cycles that represent the way life unfolds, the cycles in which life unfolds.
With some linear aspect, but fundamentally cyclical. So I realized that indeed what had to happen with living systems is that they were constituted by cyclical molecular processes, in which the result were the living system. So the question was, what cyclical processes result in something that if I look at it as a discrete entity, I say, ah, there is a living system. And okay, so living systems are molecular cyclical dynamics in which everything can change without ever interrupting the cyclical dynamic that produce the same network of molecular processes. Very good. So in that sense, living systems were closed systems. Yes, they were open to the flow of matter, to the flow of energy, but in their constitution, dynamic constitution as molecular entities were closed. The word of autopoiesis came much later, because I was reaching to this answer sometime in 1963, but the word of autopoiesis, I thought that I invented it. Indeed, was a word used by Aristoteles some 2,500 years before, but good word, autopoiesis. At the same time, I was studying perception, the nervous system. This was an epoch which was being permeated by the theory of communication of Shannon and Biddle. I think so. When he and his colleague.
All right. So he's speaking about these essential cycles, these cycles that are there to reproduce and self-organize the systems that we call autopoietic, of which I've just mentioned the cognitive and the social aspect. And the way they converge is that which uniquely allows for the rise of the human as we know it. And that is something that Rupert Sheldrake spoke about in his trialogue with Rolf Abraham and Terence McKenna, where he cites a man named Steve Mythen that speaks exactly of this convergence, even though Mythen is not necessarily coming from the Maturanite systems theory approach.
These ideas about conscious evolution. The first ideas that I want to talk about are put forward in a book by Stephen Mythen, M-I-T-H-E-N, called The Prehistory of the Mind. He's a British archaeologist, but in this book he's brought together a wealth of evidence from the fossil record, from archaeology, from the study of primate behavior, and from the study of child psychology, to put together a very interesting discussion of what happened to human minds during the 3.5 million years of human evolution before recorded history began. The first upright walking hominids are now believed to have emerged in Africa over 3.5 million years ago, Australopithecus. These were upright walking, tool-using, they used simple stone tools, precursors of ourselves. Human history, 3.5 million years of it, went on before we have the records from the great civilizations. The domestication of animals, the agricultural revolution, occurred 10,000 years ago. The first civilizations about 5,000 years ago, maybe 7,000 years ago. Industrialization 200 or 300 years ago. But for the vast majority of human history, people were living in quite different way. And it seems to me a very reasonable supposition that a great deal of our psychology, a great deal of the working of our minds has been shaped by this enormously long period about which we know so little. What Mythen points out is that these, although we don't know what they thought about and how they worked, for these early human beings, these early hominids, must have had several different kinds of intelligence. They must have had a social intelligence. They were social beings. They lived in social groups. And we know from studies of chimpanzees and other social primates that there are very subtle interactions within the group. There are dominance interactions, there are cooperative interactions. And to get it right requires a kind of intelligence about how other members of the group are going to react, what's appropriate behavior, and so on. All social animals must involve some kind of social intelligence. And we can reasonably assume that our ancestors, our hominid ancestors, had a social intelligence to enable them to live together and work together in social groups. They had a technical intelligence that enabled them to make stone tools and maybe other technical devices or technical things, maybe fibers and string, which haven't left traces in the archaeological record. They must have had a natural historical intelligence, because if you're living as a hunter-gatherer, as they did, then unless you know what to hunt and how to hunt it, what the habits of the animals are that you're hunting, unless you know what to gather, where to gather it, what things are good to eat, what things are good as herbs, you don't get very far. And this requires an enormously detailed knowledge of natural history. It's not just human beings, chimpanzees have to have this, and many other creatures. So this must have been part of their mental makeup. And then at some stage they began to talk, and they must have had a linguistic intelligence. We don't know when language began. Some people put it 50,000 years ago, some people put it much longer ago, but that really nobody knows. Language leaves no fossil traces. But something very strange happened. About 100,000 years ago, our ancestors achieved brain sizes roughly the same as ours today. So for 100,000 years, human beings have had brains of the current capacity. Yet, for 100,000 years, they were not writing programs and building computers and thinking up Einstein's equations and so on. Something else was going on with those brains, and we haven't a clue what it was. The brain size, the development of current brain size, is not the reason that there's been this explosion of technical innovation recently. Brain size hasn't changed much for 100,000 years. And it wasn't until about 50,000 years ago that there was the beginnings of art, paintings in caves and that kind of thing. What happened? Why did art and civilization only begin tens of thousands of years after the brain had reached its present capacity? And what enabled these different kinds of intelligence to give rise to the agricultural revolution, modern humanity, and so on? Well, the hypothesis that Mythen puts forward is that about 50,000 years ago, some crucial transition occurred whereby these previously separate intelligences somehow came together, cross-fertilized each other, and produced the beginnings of characteristically human mentality. The connection of social and technical intelligence meant that people started using technical skills for making things like jewelry, ornaments, grave goods. The mixing of technical and natural historical intelligence led to a great improvement in hunting technologies, in weapons, in axe heads and spearheads and arrowheads and so on. The merging of social and natural historical intelligence led to a whole kind of mythic understanding of the animal and the natural world, which we find in all cultures around the world today. And with combining these with linguistic intelligence, there was a whole burst of human development, of mental development. He compares this to a cathedral. A Romanesque and Norman cathedral has side chapels almost sealed off from each other with no interaction, whereas the great Gothic cathedrals sort of open up and all these different things can mix together. Somehow he thinks this transition 50,000 years ago was associated with the origin of religion and seems to have been based on a sense of human connection, not just with the earth but with the heavens. When I asked Mythen how he understood this to have happened, especially given his chosen metaphor of the cathedral. I said, do you think there really was a breakthrough from some extraterrestrial intelligence into the human realm at that stage, since all your evidence points to it? And he said, of course not, that's impossible. And so I said, how do you know it's impossible? Since everybody all around the world, according to your own evidence, seems to have undergone this transition, it seems to have shaped human mentality as we know it. He said, oh yes, he said, well, the very fact everyone believes it shows that this is an incredibly persistent illusion. And
all right, so Sheldrake here speaks exactly of that convergence of the social systems and the cognitive systems that has led to the rise of human consciousness. And there is something to be said about a dual approach of looking at these topics. We've focused on the man in the cave, we focused on the rise and the piercing through the veil, through the surface of consciousness from an initial unconsciousness. And therefore, we are also looking at a kind of subjective view, an internal view of the rise of consciousness, whilst at the same time asking the external, you could say, scientific questions about it. However, both of these questions are essentially the same and represent that inner mystery, because we don't seem to be able to engage in the scientific study without having a kind of internal sense of it, whilst at the same time this internal sense becomes mystical and remains in the dark if we do not approach it in a systematic manner. This has been especially looked at and researched by Erich Neumann in his work on the origins and history of consciousness, where he's basically he's doing a kind of noetic archaeology, an archaeology of human thought, where he looks at how humans have conceptualized themselves and the world throughout the phase in which we attribute the initial rise of consciousness. So I'd like to quote him here from page 105, quote, "The world begins only with the coming of light, which constellates the opposition between heaven and earth as the basic symbol of all other opposites. Before that, there reigns the illimitable darkness, as is said in the Maori myth. With the rising of the sun, or in the language of ancient Egypt, the creation of the firmament, which divides the upper from the lower, mankind's day begins and its universe becomes visible with all of its contents." So you have, as an initial myth, you have the undifferentiated oneness, the undifferentiated Ouroboros, the Ouroboros being an ancient symbol that represents kind of this undifferentiated eternal oneness, but something that has not fully grasped itself yet. So this image may be familiar to many of you. The Ouroboros as symbolized by the snake biting its own tail. And this initial rise of differentiation, this separation of heaven and earth, the creation of the firmament, the separation of the self and the other, represents the first rise of consciousness, the first disclosure of being. And this being, initially seen as a unity, as a oneness, something that we are polarized towards, something we are oriented towards, this being is initially undifferentiated and only later differentiates into different forms that being expresses itself in beings we observe. For example, expresses itself in manipulable natural material entities that we would focus on when applying scientific methods or methods with a high scientific rigor in our modern understanding of it. but you also have other forms of being that pertain to the unity of our self, our soul, with the world as a whole when it comes to the time of death, when it comes to passing out of this world, or when it comes to the good, the aesthetic of beauty and the good and the true, when you speak of ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, uh, being something that is a unity of morality or aesthetics. Also, if you look at the oldest theories we know of, focusing on the oldest philosophers we have any fragments of, like Thales, he speaks of the world originating from water, from undifferentiated water, which we also have mirrored about in the Old Testament with the Spirit of God uh, resting on the waters, lying above the waters. And similarly, you have more, as thought develops further, as philosophy develops further, you get Ionian thinkers like Anaxagoras, who explicitly said that the origin of everything is the unlimited, is the undifferentiated. And this differentiation is a precondition. This you could say dispersal, as we've spoken about, is a precondition for the reconfiguration into something higher, into something that is more than the sum of its parts. That is the essential Aristotelian understanding of complexity, the degree to what something is more than the sum of its parts. And this mirrors directly, as so far we've only been speaking in mythical terms, or in the way mythically we've been understanding the rise of the creation of the world, the rise of consciousness, the disclosure of being. This mirrors directly what we've spoken about in terms of complexity, in terms of the second law of thermodynamics, in terms of the rise of complexity in systems, in autopoietic systems. So it is very much tied to and very much related to our scientific understanding of all of these things as well. Therefore, going back to this, you cannot separate them, and you must always keep in mind that initial, you could say, ungraspable unity from which both of the approaches, namely the scientific and the mythical, derive from. So what we have now is this the kind of liberation from the initial biases, the emancipation from a kind of orientation towards only the technological artifacts, only the written history, only what we know of separated into its various methodologies, and bringing them together and seeing their convergence and seeing their resonance with one another. For example, in the resonance of the autopoietic, the study of autopoietic systems, for example, biological and social systems, and the convergence of them in the study of Stephen Mythen, as earlier explained by Rupert Sheldrake. And parallel to this, the kind of the internal dynamic of the social systems, being the rise of the formalization of certain instinctual taboos, as Freud spoke about, analyzing Fraser's works, and this being accelerated, reinforced through the rise of archetypes, through memetics, through language, through the formalization of rules, and thus this kind of feedback between the social and the cognitive. And all of this essentially representing one side of the coin that is then presented through art, through myth, through stories, in the noetic archaeology, in the study of these earlier forms of technologies by Erich Neumann or by Clayton Eshelman when looking at Upper Paleolithic cave art. And another aspect I want to touch upon before wrapping this up is the idea of mythical prehistoric beings, of mythical prehistoric entities. And in the context of this, I obviously cannot leave out speaking about some of the work of Graham Hancock, which is, needless to say, something that needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. It's not something that has always been rigorously accepted by archaeological research, but it is something to think about. Most of all is when he speaks about Göbekli Tepe being a discovered archaeological site of megalithic structures, meaning stone constructions that were there for worship, that represent something that is created by a more developed high culture form of society, that has shown to have been older than 10,000 years, basically swiftly becoming the oldest structure of this sort known to us. And that really raises the question, as it has put the bar back multiple thousands of years when humans started creating these structures. And the question, obviously, that arises is, how long until we find another one that is even older, and how much further do we need to push back our idea of when these societies arose? So you have this frontier, this kind of frontier, eerie, unclear, partially speculative, partially tentative study of what could have been potential prehistoric societies and civilizations, and its convergence with myths that spoke of prehistoric times, that spoke of prehistoric peoples and civilizations. One of which is, of course, Atlantis, which Plato spoke about in his dialogue Timaeus or Critias. They're often read together. But also other forms, for example, when looking at the genealogical table of the Old Testament, where you have Noah's descendants, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, being the ancestors of our large civilizational peoples that we know of today. For example, Japheth representing the ancestor of all the Aryans, and Shem representing the ancestor of all the Semites. And before that age, it was said that there was giants roaming the earth, the Nephilim, just as the Egyptians would be saying that the gods they speak of, for example Osiris, had once been the pharaohs, had once been the rulers of the earth. The same applies to Sumerian gods, the Anunnaki, those that roamed the earth before they came. Things that have led to much speculation about early prehistoric visits from extraterrestrials, especially when it comes to the surprisingly sophisticated knowledge of ancient astrology, for example, about planets that are pretty far away, about the size of the planets. For example, is it a coincidence that Jupiter, that the Babylonians already knew as Marduk, the house god of the city of Babylon, that he was the highest god, and at the same time Jupiter represents the largest planet in our solar system? Is that a synchronistic coincidence, or is there something more to it? All of these speculations are things I do not want to get deeper into, because it is, as I said, speculation. However, it is something to keep in mind that there is, that we descend from people, we may descend from civilizations and entities that are much older and go further back than something we may know of. And that there is always an unknown aspect in which the boundaries that we are used to blur and do not keep their differences as we are used to them. And it is a kind of flexibility of thinking that is necessary to arrive at a deeper understanding of all of these topics. So I'll just present you with a little clip about what Mr. Hancock has to say about Göbekli Tepe, and that could leave us with some more questions and some more reflections on the descent of man and on that crucial and mysterious transition point that we've been speaking about today, that represents not only a historical transition point, but also transition point in our scientific methodologies of study, and a transition point in which we have a differentiation between an external scientific systematic approach to these topics and an internal mythical narrative approach to them.
I can tell you the.
So, how much of that area where Göbekli Tepe has been searched with lidar? Here it is. Here's the images. Look at that. Wow.
Yeah, there we are. That's Harappa. That's from the Indus Valley civilization. Man between two felines.
What do you think that supposedly represents?
Nobody knows what it represents, but what's intriguing is that it turns up in so many different places. But I'd like to find just give me 1 second just to find something. I hope I'm online here. I am.
How many of the areas have been searched with lidar?
Hang on, Joe. Bear with me. Just
No worries.
1 minute. This is where I have to take my bloody glasses off.
You got to go back and forth?
Yeah.
You looked at that. I'll show you that. Karen Tepe has some cool stuff that I don't think we've seen before.
There's this huge skeletal figure. This one, 12 feet high or something like that. Extraordinary.
Kind of similar to the Easter Island heads.
What's going on down there?
His hog. What do you think it is? How weird are those structures? Yeah. You know, but like the way their hands are placed, it's kind of similar to the way the Easter Island hands are placed.
Jamie, could I get plugged into the HDMI?
Sure. Do you need to?
Yeah.
Okay, pause, please. We'll pause. We'll be right back.
Good.
All right, we're back.
We're back. Okay, we found these images from. So this is from Jamie. Maybe you could expand that the Cyborg relief.
I think you have to do it.
Okay, it's on my.
Yeah.
There we go. So this is about 10,000 years old. It's from a site in the area of Göbekli Tepe called Cyborg, and it's gone.
There it is.
And it's clearly a man between two felines. And interestingly, he's holding his dick, exactly like that piece that you just showed from Karahan Tepe. And then if we go on, I don't understand what I'm doing with this thing. There it is. So then the Indus Valley, again.
Yeah, I'm controlling what's on the screen.
You are. Okay, so there's the man between two felines. Again, expand that.
So that particular image, is there any sort of a theory as to what they were trying, what that represented?
Human mastery of animals is the only one I've heard that's being suggested.
But it seems like they're trying to get him.
Well, it does in that case, rather than or that he's holding them.
Right.
He's holding them at bay,
keeping them from getting each other.
Yeah, and then if you go down to the Egyptian one, which is the Gebel El Arak knife handle, there it is. That's from ancient Egypt, pre-dynastic Egypt. Same thing.
Wow.
And then the next one is from Tiwanaku in Bolivia. That's a redrawing from Tiwanaku in Bolivia, and again, it's a man between two felines.
Wow.
So when I see this kind of complicated image turning up all around the world, I can't help feeling that there's a remote common source which is sharing. It's not each culture representing or influencing the other. It's a remote common source that they all share.
What's the last one from where's it from again?
From Tiwanaku in Bolivia.
Look, what do you think he's got in his hands?
Well, it looks like two felines that he's holding apart.
Right, but what are those things that are dangling down?
I absolutely have no idea, and I'm not sure if anybody else does, although I'm reminded in that one of the handbags that we see in some of the figures from ancient Sumer.
Right, but what is the thing on the left?
Again, I don't know, and I don't think anybody
Very
does.
strange. And what are the? Why does he have steps on his chest and a wheel? Like, what is that? You know, what is that spiral in this?
So what we basically have here is this kind of convergence of various types, although they were spatially separated, although they were different societies, they seem to have developed similar images. And that is something that we could refer to as the archetypes, something that Carl Jung has studied extensively, something that we will get into in this series as well. And that is that there's a kind of common unity originating in this Ouroboros, and this undifferentiated unity from which human consciousness arose, and that this common root, you could say, is the origin of why we have similar archetypes, similar types dispersed throughout the planet, found in different cultures. And Toynbee explains it in one way in his work that is the guiding work for this entire series, Mankind and Mother Earth. He speaks of the two factors of the speed at which new innovations are made within a culture. And in the context of this episode, we should know that innovations do not necessarily only need to mean tools, but can also mean cultural innovations, and the speed at which they are dispersed and spread. And that initially you had a much higher speed at innovation than at their speed of spreading. And then this changed, where the speed of spreading them became higher, and you had differentiation. And that is how you got the different societies, the different civilizations. But yet, before that, they had a kind of common origin, or they had a kind of phase where all of their innovations kind of became more uniform as the speed in which they came about was faster than the speed in which they would spread. And so that essentially means that this uniformity, that is the origin in which you get the similar agricultural earth and mother goddesses, for example, of Demeter, of Gaia, of Ishtar, of Isis, but the different kinds of expression that you had in through that differentiation. And now we are kind of reconverging. Our age has now gone back to that kind of form where the spread, excuse me, I got it mixed up. The spread has gotten faster than the innovation, and thus you have again more conformity, more an equalization, more convergence, and a oneness, a similarity of technology on the whole globe. In the same way, I have to correct myself earlier, you had a higher speed of expansion of spread than you had of innovation, and thus you had uniformity. And this phase in between, the rise of civilization before the age of modern technology, and after the age of early primitive cultures, was this age where this innovation was faster than the spread, and thus you had that differentiation, because innovation would become localized as it would take longer to spread it. And this is then a kind of more structural, historical way of understanding this, whilst the internal way of understanding is this initial unity that is the common core, the common origin, of which all of these archetypes and images have differentiated outwards. And that is also something that Hancock speaks about when he here compares these very, very early structures in Göbekli Tepe with the early Hindu structures or the early Egyptian structures. We will get even deeper into this. This is already pretty heavy stuff, but we'll get even deeper into this next time when speaking about innovation and when speaking about the departing fourth element. Anyone who's not familiar with that concept should check out the very first video ever on this YouTube channel, speaking of the quaternity, the departing fourth element, that which I haven't mentioned so much, namely the fourth autopoietic system of technology. And we're speaking of the rise of Technics, the rise of the mega machine that came about with human conscious evolution. And so that is what we'll be focusing on next time. If there's any questions, always make sure you can always write your questions into the chat here. Also, I have published my book on the machine, being a book on technology and the philosophy of technics, a derivative of my course. All the links to my courses are in the description. Link to my book is in the description, or you can also scan this QR code and get my book. It would support me, support my work. And also check out my Substack articles. I have one article that actually speaks about this acceleration of evolution, specifically the principles where evolution itself evolves, you could say, where evolution is something that isn't static, but something that complexifies and increases in its own sophistication. So check out my courses, check out my articles, get my book on the philosophy of technology, on the machine, where I also dive deeper into this aspect of our human coevolution with technology. Thank you very much for your attention.